Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate that. I do have a couple more questions. I want to go to a specific project. We've been talking pretty broad about the general condition of forests and forest health here, but we had the Stonewall project in the Helena, Lewis and Clark National Forest, and that would have specifically managed vegetation to benefit wildlife, specifically. But Cottonwood-inspired litigation delayed the project. So I'm going to divide this into two separate questions. How would this project have benefited? I want to get the environment from you, Mr. Wood, and then following, if you could tell me how would it have benefited wildlife, Mr. Bronson, from you in Montana. So if you could please.
So the question is, how would it benefit the environment different than wildlife? So I shouldn't address?
Yeah, let him address the wildlife. We're going to have you address the environment. How would that have benefited the environment?
So wildfire risk is a huge problem for water quality and air quality. We in Montana breathe the trees that burn in California and Oregon. So when we don't address these projects quickly, the environmental consequences are not limited to the area. They spread wherever the smoke goes.
Mr. Bronson, wildlife.
The Stonewall project in Montana involved elk management objectives that were trying to increase the quality of grazing, to increase opening up some areas and reducing canopy cover so that there was improved grass and forage production, which is what elk eat. It was specifically aimed at improving the habitat to benefit the elk in the area. One of the things that we've seen in Montana and in other places is that in 1984, when the Elk Foundation started, elk spent most of their time on federal national forest land. And we're seeing more and more that elk are not spending as much time on that public land because the improved habitat on private land, industrial forests, and places, that's where the elk are spending more of their time. And that's creating additional problems. You know, one of the problems in Montana is that elk sometimes are impacting agriculture on private lands. Well, those elk didn't used to do that because they were on the national forests. And it's because of declining habitat quality on the national forests.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bronson. And I would say that probably the declining condition of the forest has a lot to do with this graph that we see here, where we used to have probably 20 times more forests being harvested, which created browse, which created that understorage that they would actually be able to consume instead of having the old growth forests, which wildlife just not, I'm not a biologist, so what wildlife will we find in these old forests that are choked out with deadfalls?
Not very much, especially the older filled-in conifer forests. Red squirrels are one of the mammalian species that are present, but a lot of the species that many of us are focused on and care about, they do require openings. They require edge habitat. They require a more diverse mix of forest. Large stands and large tracts of old growth are not as productive for most wildlife species.
Thank you so much. And again, what we see is this broad range between what used to be harvested out of the forest, where the wildfires were, the acreage that they consumed, and where it has grown to today. Now, I'm not a scientist, but it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that when you decrease the amount of timber that you're taking out of the forest, is it safe to say, Mr. Wood, that it's going to come out of the forest in the form of smoke instead of logs?
Yeah, absolutely right. I agree with Ms. Brown's comment earlier that commercial timber harvesting is what funds the non-commercial harvesting that has to happen. A lot of the greatest fire risk comes from small diameter trees and brush, but we can't afford to get that out if we're not doing commercial timber harvesting as well.
Finally, Mr. Bronson, if I could, I have seen the land after a wildfire has gone through, and because of the excessive fuel supply that is there, typically those lands are sterile for quite some time. They have ruined the air quality, as we've had other witnesses state before, that we end up breathing the timber that is burning in California, in my home state of Montana. But we also see a deteriorating land quality, we see water quality, we see fisheries, and they are destroyed for many, many years. Would you say that we're putting other animals at risk of being listed on the Endangered Species Act by the destruction of so much habitat?
We certainly aren't reducing the quality of habitat, which is diminishing species and populations, yes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, I would yield back.